My name is Alexandra Mousavizadeh, and I'm a partner at Tortoise Media. We also are the publishers of the Global AI Index, which is relevant for this conversation. And with me, I have Philip Young, who is Head of Strategy Delivery for Digital Catapult. And I want you to just explain a little bit about Digital Catapult. It was so interesting. I was just worried that I wasn't going to get it all right. And Neira Hajro, who is a partner at McKinsey and actually has just published an amazing survey on digital behavior preferences that we're going to dig into in a minute. But and thank you so much for being here in person. This is one of the first hybrid events almost post-pandemic, and it's lovely to see actual people in the audience. And so please, jump in, raise your hand. Love to hear contributions, comments, and questions. And I also have a lovely iPad here, so anyone who wants to place questions or comments digitally, I will go to them as well. But Philip, I wanted to start with you.
Yeah. Nice.
And first of all, I just want to ask you to just tell us a little bit more about Digital Catapult, and then I would love for you to talk about an upcoming big body of research in the form of an index that looks at the capabilities and capacity to develop tools that are related to AI and robotics and so on, that you're going to explain much better than I am.
No
and then I'd like you to take us through what that is, what it is and what it's showing us, and then I'll jump in with questions.
Yeah, no worries. Great. Well, I suppose for the topic of this conversation as well, this really is the new normal, right? This hybrid world of physical and digital and virtual. So just a quick introduction to Digital Catapult for those of you who don't know too much about it. We're a national innovation centre for R&D, focusing on emerging technologies, advanced digital technologies as we describe them. So predominantly for us, that's four key technology areas. So the first one is advanced networks. That includes 5G and IoT. The second is artificial intelligence and machine learning. The third is immersive technology, so virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, and haptics. And the final one is distributed ledger technologies, but predominantly outside of the financial services. So we're looking at its application through things like smart contracts and in things like supply chains and such. So to touch upon what Digital Catapult does, I suppose, a little bit, we are here to help to drive adoption of these technologies, both in their own right, but also in their convergence. So what we're starting to see is a huge shift towards how each of those technologies is incredibly important, but also equally important in their combination in application on the industry side. So when it's being used in a variety of different settings, you tend to find it's more than just one of those technologies, and there's starting to be a convergence of all of those things. And so we run acceleration programs like our MI Garage program, which won an award earlier, as well as the 5G test beds that we have across the UK to allow startups to experiment with what 5G might mean for their business models, as well as working with industry in a variety of different sectors. So that really brings us to the research, really. What we are looking at is how the UK in particular is positioned at a global level across those technologies in their entirety. So what we're looking at is this new type of technology convergence, which is creating a cyber-physical system-based technology stack, which is driving towards the blurring between the digital and the physical worlds. So we're starting to see how AI is integrating with things like immersive technologies, where you see machine vision being used in specific scenarios for augmented reality. And there's scope that then goes to certain scales when you're looking at IoT deployments and 5G. So we're starting to look at quite exponential scale. And so for us, the index is all about the view of how each country has a really strong base level of infrastructure at the bottom. So all the skills, the capabilities, the technologies and the networks, and how strong each country is in that, as well as then each technology area that I mentioned, and how that then comes together into a range of different capabilities, like things like digital twins, which is a digital replica of a physical environment or asset that type of thing is being created by this convergence. And so it's a really important thing as an economic indicator for not just the UK, but on a global economy scale. And we're starting to see how that then is converging with the pandemic. So, this stuff was happening anyway. Now suddenly you're throwing a whole different world of being, mostly at home, mostly working in, our one-bedroom flats like myself in London and elsewhere. And we're starting to think, how do we work collaboratively together, even though we can't travel to see each other? So there's a really interesting set of use cases that are starting to emerge from the interviews that we've conducted. We have about 150 plus data points from what we're working for the index, plus we've done over 40 to 50 interviews. So if anyone is interested in interviewing, we'd be very happy to, and we're looking to publish that in September.
Could you give us I know it's not going to be published until the fall, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay,
yeah.
But preliminary results are showing there's strength in, I guess, US and China come top, and then you've got the UK probably there. So can you sort of talk to us a little bit about the profiles of the countries in sort of the top three and what comes after that, but also sort of dive into what you're seeing of strengths that the UK has that might be unique, and what does that tell us about where, on sort of what path the UK is on compared to other countries in the index?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think all of these things kind of come together basically in a bit of a story. So cyber-physical environments or use cases essentially are evolving out of a range of different needs from businesses, which are often driven by consumers, which we'll touch upon shortly as well. But the really interesting thing that we're starting to see, so you're right, and I add many caveats to this because we are still in the throes of our index. So, but we are starting to see that, the US is still leading as expected. China are second, but actually the UK has narrowed the gap a little bit from what I expected at the very least in terms of our closeness to China, in terms of our capabilities. And that's largely because a lot of the deployment of things like cyber physical infrastructure or capabilities that require large amounts of data also require large amounts of trust. Now, I know trust is bandied about quite a lot. Lots of people discuss it. It means lots of different things to lots of different people. But when it comes to the scale of data that we're talking about and the level of connectivity and the amount of processing that would happen to make effective decisions and accurate decisions, the quality of that data, the ethical capabilities of that data and dynamics of that data, and the responsible nature of that data is also incredibly important for businesses and consumers. So as a result, what we're starting to see from a lot of the conversations is that becomes an important indicator of whether a product or service is being developed. So ethics by practice and data integrity. And so we're starting to see a bit of a journey towards an increased interest in that for the UK side. And what does that mean, I suppose, in the sort of medium to long term? Well, the UK is drawing upon a whole host of different positions of strength. Your index is brilliant, Alexandra, as well. And the AI side of things, we all know we're exceptionally strong. From DCMS's perspective, have invested a huge amount of money and activity into the 5G testbeds and trials program, which has driven UK capabilities in 5G. So I think we've been doing some really exciting things around that. You look at immersive, our creative sector really is strong as well. So we are driving immersive applications and interfaces, and it's really exciting. And blockchain, we had a world-leading financial services sector that's basically stimulated one of the best blockchain environments in the world, and exceptionally strong DLT companies. So all of those things puts us in a really, really strong position, combined with our research environment, our innovation environment, and a whole host of exciting startups in this space.
And in a minute, we'll go to Neira, and talk about the financial services and trust and your amazing piece of research that came out a couple of weeks ago. But before we go to you, Neira, I just wanted to ask you one more question, Philip, and that is, it's fascinating trying to study and wrap metrics around something that seems to have no outer limits, right? We don't know where this is going. And you are looking at the sort of the physical space going into the digital space and vice versa, and those sort of coming together. Can you give us some examples of, when we talked earlier, you talked about building, using 3D, for example. But I wonder if you could just give us some examples of what you're seeing out there on the horizon.
Yeah, sure.
Because we're talking about the new normal,
of course,
as in like what will be the new normal, given what you can see through the index of things that are coming at us.
So there's some really interesting examples, and startups usually are the best example, but also there's some interesting ones on the corporate side. But I'll start with an example of Gravity Sketch, for example. Some people may know them already. They're an immersive company. They basically look at virtual reality design environments. So you can basically go into a VR room and you can design things like a car or an airplane or whatever you really want within that environment. It allows you to walk around it and really explore what it looks like in the physical space as well. They've seen an uptick of around 40% of new business during the course of the pandemic. So because designers can't physically go to that location to design things, what we're starting to see is that these digital tools are starting to be used in different ways. But the challenge will be how that then takes to the next level, where you might think, well, how could we use augmented reality and then have a digital twin of an asset or a machine or something like that in front of us, so that we can all see it, that model, and we can kind of move it around and tweak it. So there's some interesting things. I mean, we're talking probably a few further years out, but emerging sort of convergence of that and what is described as the metaverse, which is augmented reality cloud, where you have at scale augmented reality, and maybe in the future AR glasses that you walk down the road and you kind of interact with your different technologies. There's a whole host of different data components to that, which for the new normal is really both exciting, but also quite challenging. So we need to be aware that if we're living and working from home a lot more, we're passing a lot of data through on ourselves, and businesses are looking at ways that they can manage the trust of these things. How do we make sure that we have a voice into that to say, this is how to do it sensibly, sustainably, and is able to drive real business value and economic value, but also societal value as well?
Just one last question, because it's an index, and will give you the comparability across many nations. First of all, how many countries will you have in the index, and are there, from your preliminary results, so you would probably your top 10 countries will probably not be a surprise who they are and probably in what rank order they land in your index. But in terms of other things that you're seeing from countries that maybe are accelerating really quickly right now, that might be something for the UK to look at down the road, where would you say there are things that you're seeing that's interesting or caught you by surprise?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, it's still early days, so the data is still coming through a little bit. But where we've seen some really interesting insights is actually in not just one country, but on global supply chains. So we're starting to see that in the height of the pandemic, you ran out of toilet paper in your local supermarket, right? And a lot of supply chains, people were kind of looking at that and saying, well, we've got toilet paper in our warehouse, and for some reason, we're not getting it to the stores quick enough. And part of the challenge for that was actually that an operational efficiency level on logistics that operates not just on a UK supply chain level, but across multiple countries. And you're only as strong as your weakest digital part of your supply chain. So if you cannot see where a particular component of your supply chain hasn't come together, or you don't have the transparency across it, it's incredibly difficult. But it's also incredibly empowering as well. So there is a company called AgriLedger, who are a DLT company that we've worked with. They've been doing work with mango farmers, for example, in Haiti, where they're looking at putting a sensor on a box of mangoes, tracking it, the temperature and things like that, and then also putting that on a distributed ledger so that you can track and trace each component of where that mango travels across the supply chain to the end consumer. What that's allowed them to do is actually see where they can cut out certain aspects of their middlemen and reduce their costs. And actually, it's resulted in 7.5 times increase in their in their revenue, which is a significant amount for a mango farmer in Haiti, right? So it's those sort of things that are great examples that actually it doesn't matter if it's an individual company who we can learn from and excel. You know, we can look at the US, we can look at Germany, we can look at great countries like that. But there are examples coming up for this cyber physical infrastructure underpinned by these technologies all over the world. It's the leaders of that economic growth are going to be the ones who deploy the right infrastructure in trusted and sensible and sustainable ways.
We can't wait to see the index coming out. Neira, can we turn to you? You've had this fascinating report being released from McKinsey 2 weeks ago. The new normal, through your survey, can you talk to us about the findings of your research?
Of course. I also thought it was a little bit, it kind of paints the picture of today so very well that we're sitting in a cinema with a mask around the wrist. So as you mentioned, you know, McKinsey in serving our clients has done a lot of surveys and repeat surveys about consumer expectations from digital. And that survey became that much more interesting in 2020 and 2021 when we saw a significant acceleration. And basically what ended up happening is we saw every single region in the world see new digital users and increased digital usage. You know, whether that was North America, Europe, LATAM, everybody went accelerated. Europe was one of the leaders in the pack because of our infrastructure, because of, you know, fairly sophisticated users, and Europe accelerated as well. And UK, you know, very sophisticated digital economy, also saw new users come online. And we basically also saw a lot of people start using services that they didn't use digitally before, such as education and healthcare and even grocery. And, you know, you could observe what happened over the last 18 months and a couple of things jump out. So 2020, you see a lot of the countries go to the upper right. So you see a lot of new users, you see a lot of digital usage. 2021, you know, due to the success of different vaccine programs, you see many countries actually start to relax some of the lockdown constraints. However, digital usage continues going up. So, you know, we basically look at the number of consumers, about 50% of them say that COVID has shifted their usage and their behavior, but about 30 of them say that they've shifted it due to convenience. So not much to actually do with COVID. Now, we then also ask consumers, what do they expect to do over the next 6 to 12 months? And, you know, in a way, unsurprisingly, you'll see some of the consumers say that they are looking to use digital less. So in the UK alone, there's about 9 million consumers who said they were going to slip back in terms of their digital usage. It doesn't mean they're going to go cold turkey, but they're going to use it less. And then the industries where you see that slippage are industries that saw the largest gains during COVID. So whether it's grocery, whether it's healthcare, education, you saw people kind of swing to the right and now start swinging to the left. And, you know, we started basically asking consumers why that is the case. And some of it was, unsurprisingly, you know, people are just tired of Zooms, of VCs, of sitting in front of their laptop, and they want to start shifting their behavior to what it was before. Some of it was also because those industries had to shift overnight. And the way they shifted wasn't actually that convenient, that it wasn't seamless for users. And some of those experiences are not where they need to be. So consumers want to go physical, but then also businesses just didn't really create a great experience because they had to do it overnight. I mean, based on some of our statistics, we went from about 2020 to 2025 in a span of 8 weeks. Now, imagine businesses needing to shift the entire way in which they speak to consumers, their entire business model overnight, when we know that majority of those businesses struggled with their digital agenda pre-COVID. So, you know, we basically see a lot of those consumers basically saying they're going to use less. And Philip and I were talking about this. When we talk, like, what are the major barriers? The first one is trust. So, you know, whether you look at it from the business side or from the consumer side, a lot of consumers are basically saying trust in digital services, in your identity, in the payment details is what stands in the way of them using digital more. Second one is channels. You'll see when the report is actually out, and we talk about phygital as the new norm. So being able to mesh the physical experience with digital and make it seamless. And then the third one is about the experience. A lot of digital and online journeys still are not really tailored to how consumers use them and how they want to use it. So, businesses have an opportunity to improve those experiences and make sure that, they lend themselves very easily to browsing, to shopping, to any operational support that they may need afterwards.
Is this a phygital experience we're having? Because it's hybrid.
As you said, from this side, it feels very physical, but as you said, it is a prime example of a phygital experience.
Now, there's so many rich examples in the research that you've done, and I'm just wondering if there's sort of a couple of things that I would love you to draw out. I mean, first of all, the surprises in the sectors of where it was stickier, right, where people actually, you would think they would go digital, but they actually didn't for a variety of reasons. And also, if you could talk us through which sector it was that had the sort of the biggest acceleration. That's question one. Question two, if you could just sort of take a step back also and look at through, I believe you've done this survey a couple of times, just like looking at which countries are pulling ahead. That might be surprising as well in the survey. So sectors and then countries, and then I'd love us to go back to trust, because I think it sort of sits both on the consumer side, but also on the business side, as Philip has talked about.
Yeah. So a couple of things that were surprising to me. The first one is that Europe started as the leading continent, but it's now behind. If we look at the ranking of the countries, the first one is India, the second one is Brazil, and then the third one is the UK. So in a way, the other regions, the other continent overshot, right? And that's one of the conversations I have with our clients. Why are we falling behind? The second one is that I found surprising is that UK was always a leading digital economy in Europe out of all the large markets. I think, you have a lot of the countries in Scandinavia, but in terms of their scale, it's slightly different. And even in the UK, we saw acceleration. So even there, we saw headroom, which I think is very encouraging. The third thing that I also found surprising is that, if you look at it today in the UK out of industries, the only one where consumers still prefer physical over digital is grocery. In every other industry, digital is the preferred channel by which consumers use it. And then one that, I'm going to be biased and I'm going to really like is if you look at innovation, industries that are seen as digital and as innovative from the digital point of view are also embraced by users more. So in a way, it creates a really nice flywheel. The more innovative you're perceived, the more users come to you, the more you know how people use your services, your websites, your assets, the more informed you are about how to innovate more. So it creates a really nice flywheel that I like to describe as it pays to be innovative and digital. Now, that was one of the questions in terms of what was surprising. The other thing that I think is really important to note is when you look at a lot of the services that we were buying pre-COVID, they were digital and they were constrained to either our local community or our country. Then COVID came and the borders just erased. We have a lot of examples where students tuned in to listen to MIT lectures rather than their local university. A lot of people went to Harley Street specialists instead of their own. Right. So all of a sudden, if you're going to have a VC consultation or VC lecture, it didn't matter what was around you. What mattered was who was best at it. And I think this sets a new bar for businesses. So it's no longer that if you're a consumer and your local business looks at its peers to decide where to invest, what to have. The businesses need to look globally and they need to look across industries because the users, consumers became that much more sophisticated and they became very good at trading, finding the best services for the money they're willing to spend. Sorry.
Quick question on that, if I may. When you talk about slippage, and I know the numbers that you're referring to are in the UK, but I'm just wondering if you could sort of unpack the slippage a bit. The slippage presumably would not be on education and access, because once you've entered that space and the world has been opened up, that will presumably stay. Or am I wrong? In your study, where do you see people, when people say we'll probably go back, what are we going back on?
Mm-hmm. So I think it's important to, as you said, to qualify the slippage. And that's why we wanted to make sure it's not seen as going back. Mm-hmm. It's reducing. And you have that reduction, as you said, both in terms of countries as well as industries. So one of the questions that Alexandra asked is, Nordics were always extremely digitally sophisticated, and they became even more so, and they're still very much in the lead. But what was really surprising is that you have a lot of countries in Central Europe and in Southern Europe who went from relatively not digitally sophisticated countries to being fairly sophisticated, and they're actually not showing that much slippage. And what we're seeing there is that you had a certain set of consumers who weren't exposed to digital services. And now that they were exposed to digital services, they don't want to go back. Some of those preferences are still staying and they continue to use. However, I would offset that with countries, for example, Belgium, Germany, and Switzerland, which weren't very digitally sophisticated to start with. They made a lot of progress, or they accelerated a lot during COVID, but they're looking to slip back a lot as well. And one of the reasons why we believe that's the case is if you look at the payments landscape specifically, we always say that the slippage is a function of the infrastructure that's there in place in the country, as well as consumer preferences. In some of these countries, the infrastructure is not necessarily there. So, for example, in Germany, the payments is still dominated by cash and bank transfers, and if you're in an economy that's still dominated by cash, going digital is very hard. And if you're given an opportunity, going back is something that you're going to take. In terms of industries, as you said, banking, I mean, we always look at banking as having the lowest NPS score in any country in terms of how users perceive it, right? Banks are always out to get you in a way. But, if you look at digital, banking reigns supreme. In terms of like digital capabilities, the experience, and specifically trust. People look at banking as the example industry that sets the bar for what the digital experience should look like. And there, we only have two industries where people said they're going to increase their usage of digital post-COVID. One is banking and the other one is travel. In pretty much every other industry, we're expecting to see slippage. And education, healthcare, and groceries are the ones that are going to see largest slippage. Not that we're going to erase the gains, but we're going to basically lose some of the gains that we've made over the last 18 months.
It's so interesting. And I want to just ask you one last question, then throw that same question back to Philip, because when you see this acceleration, in spite of some slippage going forward, there's obviously some who are going to be, and you've got new users coming in as well, I think, and I'd love to hear a bit more about sort of the profile of the people who are coming in. There are some people who are going to be left out. And then there's a question about what is that driving in, and what do we do about the people who don't have access? There's a lot of, I know you don't give policy recommendations per se, but from your observations, you're seeing this roll out, you're seeing the uptake, and a lot of that will stick. And so within the UK, for example, what would you recommend from what you're seeing? And I would also then throw that to you, Philip. What do you see in terms of, the global South and North, but also the UK, for example? And what do we do? Because we're looking at a new normal, and a new normal might require certain new ways of thinking about providing access or providing support for people who don't have it? What kind of institutions do we need for the future to address some of these things that are coming out of your studies?
So as you said, the way I always think about it is that, we went from 2019 to 2025 and we're now coming back to 2023. I think that's a good way to kind of keep things in perspective. When we look at who's joined over the last 18 months, the average user was 5 years younger and they were about 30% more affluent. They were 30% more likely to be urban. And as you said, when we looked at the survey, one of the things that jumped out at us was there's a number of people who were left behind, and they were left behind, whether it's due to infrastructure in the country. So for example, one of the things that even I wasn't aware, but in the Nordics, you have a single sign-on, meaning that if you have a digital username, it works across a range of services and it's authenticated. So it just makes it that much easier to participate in the economy.
Would that work in the UK, do you think, to have a system like that?
So I think it's a great point from two perspectives. The first one is, we're sitting on a number of historical investments. If we look at our fiber, if we look at the broadband that we have across the country, there are parts that are not included. I think that there's a second piece, which is a lot around data privacy and who handles it. And as you said, we don't find ourselves in a position to make policy recommendations, but if we see this new normal, and the conversations I have with organizations is, if the bar is now global for what the consumer expects, the competition is on. You really want to have your digital agenda tight. You want to be running as fast as you can, because you don't want to be left behind as a business, but at the same time, you don't want to be left behind as an individual. Mm-hmm. And one of the follow-ups from our survey that we're currently considering is trying to look at the consumers who are left behind in select geographies, because as you said, we want to drill down on what it would take to bring some of those users as a part of this new economy, this new normal. And we're looking to do that across countries. For example, choosing one from Central Europe where we saw these gains and, expectation that it's going to continue. One from the UK because it's our local community. And then one from countries, for example, in Germany, where you see significant intent to slip back, because what you do in each country is going to be dependent on both the consumer preferences in that country, but then also the infrastructure that's there. Because if you want to change, the change will have to be fairly broad.
Yeah. And I want to flip that to you. But one thing that I found really interesting is that you actually had China in terms of, I guess you call it digital use or uptake,
yes,
was number 4 or 5. Is that right?
That's correct.
So it's behind India, which you would have imagined that there'd been higher penetration simply given the system. Is there a reason why it's sitting there behind the UK? Well, is that the data that's hard to...
It's data is a little bit hard always to interpret, but it is a very broad country. It is very much a country that has a very wide set of industries, some that do not lend themselves more digitally than some of the industries in Europe. So as you said, there is a context for why China would be slightly behind.
Okay. Philip, what do you... Inequality, I guess, or the difference in access.
It's really fascinating, actually. Because I think a lot of governments around the world and businesses are really looking at innovating or driving innovation, right? And so you have this kind of increased interest, investment, into things like R&D. But where it comes down to real economic gains and growth is when you look at programs that support innovative startups and scale-ups. So particularly where there might be market or capability failures to then penetrating new markets. And if you look, speaking specifically about the UK first, you can extrapolate this out a little. But if you look at the AI, for example, as a technology area, 85% of AI companies in the UK, there's about 1,700 companies, startups, are focused predominantly, and speak to your point about finance leading the way, they're predominantly focused on fintech, ad tech, some on health tech. Where there is a lack of supply or capability, is not in the skills of AI. It's in the application of AI into specific sectors that underpin regional economies. So when you look at industrial applications, for example, almost inversely, it's 15% of AI companies are focused on more traditional sectors and of the economy. So if 85% are currently based in London and the Golden Triangle, and 15% of them are focused on industrial applications, I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer that there's a correlation there. And the problem is that a lot of regional economies, and perhaps more, if you take it outside the UK, as I said, you look at different countries, a lot of that is industrially underpinned. So that they maybe produce lots of food, or they may produce parts of that are part of the global supply chain for a particular bit of machinery or whatever it is. Industrial underpins a huge amount of elements across the global economy, but yet digitalization is really, really struggling to penetrate. And it's because we're all thinking, well, let's do more R&D, and they spend huge amounts of R&D in those areas, but the penetration is still low, the adoption is still low. It's because the supply side are just, quite frankly, on the startup side, it's a slow-moving sector. I can't get a customer pipeline as quickly as I can in fintech. It's not geographically down the road. It's incredibly difficult to build products and services in that area that are going to have market traction to scale. But the value of doing it for an economy is significant. So where I see there being the sort of the trade-off of it is that governments need to consider at a global level how to stimulate better supply-side capabilities in traditional sectors that underpin certain economies, that bring together a range of different technologies, enable them in specific environments, specific use cases that can demonstrate to wider organizations and sectors how they can use that, let's say in manufacturing or construction or the such. And so by doing that, I think you will be able to reduce the level of disparity between countries and between regions within countries as well, because you won't be so focused on digitalizing finance, for example, which is doing pretty well on its own.
Yeah. I know we've only got 1 minute left. I just want to make sure that if there's any questions from the room, we should probably take them now. But just going back to that, you talk about adoption rates, and adoption rates are, supported by all the things you just mentioned, but also by levels of trust. So I just wondered if we could, just before we end, from both of you, get sort of the linkage between trust and adoption rates, presuming that that's a good thing. Just how do you build that trust, and from the business side and from the consumer side? Like, talk to us a bit about, I know we don't have many seconds left, about the link between consumer and adoption, behavior and trust. Philip, Neira, you go first, sorry.
I was going to say, so I think when we talk about trust, it's such a broad term that I think, one of the things we tried to crystallize from the survey is, what does that mean? And it comes to two things for consumers. One is being data and privacy. So how do I make sure that I give you data and you're going to use it responsibly? And again, banks do really, really well. A little bit surprisingly, entertainment doesn't do well at all. So you basically see a big difference in terms of what consumers think is a great experience. The other one is this ability to step in during transactions. So, if businesses could assure users that at times of trouble and friction, if it's very well delineated what they will do for buyers and sellers, that goes also a long way to contributing to that trust. So, be responsible and careful with my data. And if something happens, be very clear of how you're going to engage.
That's great.
I completely agree. I think consumers define and dictate almost a lot of what businesses focus on as well, and that trust element is critical. And particularly as we've both mentioned and seen from the surveys, this kind of combination of the physical and digital coming together at the scales we're talking about, the trust is incredibly important, not just an individual business level, but at a sector level, and then also at a national level and international level. So it's kind of across all permeations of it. And the really important thing is that in order to build products and services that are going to be scalable, exportable, businesses have to make sure that they are thinking about the trust elements and sustainability of what they're building and the responsible nature of how they're processing data. Companies who are looking at trying to develop new business models that are exploring data, which they haven't previously worked on, need to take serious consideration about how they're going to do that. So for me, yeah, trust is fundamental, and I think the countries that will lead in the world for this will bake in trustworthiness into the innovation and R&D environments that they set up, and consider that as they are developing both regulations and law in a way that still stimulates innovation, but at the same time balances it with a level of trust that people can build into.
And I think we're just about there, because the EU has just issued their AI draft regulation report that everyone is chewing over right now. But I know we're out of time, quite badly, I'm told. So thank you, Neira. Thank you so much, Philip, for your amazing conversation and contributions today. We're looking forward to seeing the index and the continuation of the survey going forward. So round of applause for our speakers. Thank you so much.
Thanks.